The moment my garage door rattled open and a stranger stepped inside, my stomach dropped because nothing good ever starts that way. I was in the kitchen refilling my coffee when I heard metal scrape concrete, a sound that didn't belong in a quiet suburban morning. At first I thought a neighbor dropped something, but then my phone buzzed with a security alert showing my garage camera live. A yellow tow truck arm was extended halfway inside my private garage, inches from my pickup, and a woman I recognized all too well was pointing like she owned the place. This wasn't just any neighbor. This was the HOA, Karen who'd spent months sending violation letters for imaginary rules, measuring lawns with a tape, and lecturing delivery drivers about parking. She had already fined me twice for visual clutter, meaning my legally parked truck. Now she'd apparently escalated from paperwork to trespassing. I rushed outside, heart pounding, and demanded to know what was happening. She spun around, chin raised, announcing she was enforcing community standards. She claimed my truck violated overnight parking rules, ignored the fact it was inside my locked garage, and ordered the tow driver to hook it immediately. The audacity was stunning, but the driver looked uncomfortable, eyes darting between us. I told him calmly that the garage was part of my private property, and that she had no authority here. Karen cut me off, waving a clipboard inches from his face, insisting she'd authorized removal. She even tried to block me from stepping closer, acting like security. That's when the tow driver paused, lowered the arm, and asked her a question that changed everything. "Did you have written consent from the homeowner to enter this garage?" She froze. I saw it in her eyes. She didn't. She never did. Her voice shifted from confident to shrill as she argued technicalities. The driver stepped back, pulled out his phone, and said he wasn't risking his license. If someone entered a garage without consent, that was a police matter. As he dialed, Karen's expression collapsed from smug to panicked, and I realized this story was just beginning. I had no idea that her single reckless decision would unravel years of intimidation, expose how far she'd gone, and turn her favorite weapon against her. Standing there, watching the police call connect, I felt a strange calm replace my anger. Whatever happened next, it would be documented, undeniable, and completely out of her control. And that realization made all the difference. I didn't know it yet, but this confrontation would end very differently than she ever imagined. Once the law arrived and truth prevailed publicly, the tow driver stayed by his truck, arms crossed, while Karen paced like a trapped animal, still insisting she was right. She kept repeating that the HOA owned enforcement authority, a phrase she clearly loved, as if saying it enough times could make it true. I stood quietly near my garage entrance, resisting the urge to argue, because I knew every word she spoke was digging her deeper. Within minutes, the first police cruiser rolled in. Karen straightened her posture instantly, switching tones like a bad actor changing roles. She greeted the officer with exaggerated friendliness, explaining how she was protecting the community from a rule breaker. She claimed I had refused compliance and that the tow was necessary. The officer listened patiently, then turned to me and asked one simple question. "Did I give permission for anyone to enter my garage?" I said no. That was it. No speech. No emotion. Just no. The officer nodded and asked the tow driver to confirm who called him. The driver explained that Karen contacted his company claiming the vehicle was illegally parked on HOA-controlled property. When the officer asked if he'd been told the truck was inside a private garage, the driver shook his head. He added that once he realized the situation, he stopped immediately and called police himself. Karen's confidence cracked. She interrupted repeatedly, trying to cite bylaws and pointing toward the street as if that somehow included my garage. The officer stopped her mid-sentence and asked for documentation, giving her authority to enter a homeowner's garage. She rifled through her clipboard, papers fluttering, but found nothing. Her face flushed red as the silence stretched. The officer explained calmly that a garage attached to a home is private property. Entering it without consent, or ordering someone else to do so, could constitute trespassing. He asked her directly if she authorized the tow truck to enter the garage. She hesitated, then said yes, because she had to. That admission changed the atmosphere instantly. The officer stepped aside and radioed for a second unit. Karen's voice rose, demanding to know why this was escalating. I could see neighbors starting to gather, drawn by the flashing lights. Phones came out. Whispers spread. For the first time since I'd moved here, Karen wasn't controlling the narrative. The second officer arrived and asked me to recount everything from the beginning. As I spoke, Karen tried to interrupt again but was told firmly to wait. Her hands shook as she clutched the clipboard that had once made her feel powerful. The officer then turned to her and asked if she understood that HOA rules do not override state property law. She didn't answer. She couldn't. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about my truck anymore. It was about accountability, and it was finally catching up to her in front of everyone. As the officers compared notes, the energy on my driveway shifted from confrontation to consequence. Karen was no longer directing anyone. She stood off to the side, arms crossed tightly, eyes darting between the police, the tow driver, and the small crowd of neighbors forming along the sidewalk. The clipboard that once felt like a badge of authority now looked like a flimsy prop. One officer asked her to explain her role in the HOA. She proudly said she was the enforcement chair, emphasizing the word like it carried legal weight. The officer nodded and asked if she'd received training on the limits of HOA authority. That question caught her off guard. She hesitated, then said she didn't need training because the bylaws were very clear. The officer asked to see them. She handed over a folder, fingers trembling. While he flipped through the pages, he explained something that made several neighbors lean closer. HOA rules can regulate shared spaces and visible exteriors, but they do not grant permission to enter a homeowner's dwelling or garage. Even enforcement actions require proper notice and due process. Calling a tow truck to enter a closed garage crossed a serious line. Karen tried to argue that the garage door was open a little, which she claimed made it accessible. I showed the officer my security footage on my phone, clearly showing her opening it herself after unlocking the exterior latch. The tow driver confirmed he watched her do it. That was the moment her story completely fell apart. The officer asked her why she thought this was acceptable. She said she was tired of people getting away with things, and that if she didn't act, the neighborhood would fall apart. Her voice wavered, revealing frustration that went far deeper than my truck. The officer listened, then explained that frustration doesn't justify trespassing. At that point, he informed her she was being investigated for criminal trespass and for directing an unlawful tow. Her eyes widened. She asked if this was really necessary, gesturing to the crowd. The officer responded calmly that consequences don't disappear just because people are watching. In fact, transparency was important. Another neighbor stepped forward and quietly told the police she'd had similar issues with Karen, entering her backyard to inspect a shed. Then another neighbor spoke up about receiving fines without warnings. What started as my problem was quickly becoming a pattern. The officers exchanged looks, clearly recognizing this wasn't an isolated incident. Karen's posture slumped. The authority she'd built through intimidation evaporated as the reality set in that her actions had witnesses, records, and now police attention. The tow driver, still standing nearby, shook his head and said he'd never seen someone so confidently wrong. Watching her unravel, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt relieved. For the first time, the power imbalance was gone. She was just another person accountable to the same laws as everyone else. The officers separated Karen from the growing crowd and spoke to her quietly near the curb. But their serious expression said more than their words ever could. She kept nodding, then shaking her head, as if trying to negotiate reality itself. Meanwhile, one officer stayed with me and explained what would happen next. A formal report would be filed, the tow attempt documented, and the HOA board notified of her actions. This wasn't something that could be swept under the rug. Karen suddenly demanded to speak to the HOA president, insisting this was all a misunderstanding. The officer told her she was welcome to make phone calls, but that didn't change the facts. She had entered private property without consent and ordered a tow under false pretenses. That was the issue, plain and simple. Hearing it stated so clearly felt surreal. After months of her bending rules to her advantage, the tow driver was asked if he wanted to press charges for being misled into an illegal tow. He said he was considering it, explaining that situations like this could cost him his license. Karen overheard that and looked genuinely scared for the first time. She tried to apologize to him directly, but he stepped back and said apologies didn't undo paperwork. One officer then asked me if I wanted to pursue trespassing charges. I paused. Part of me wanted this to end quietly, but another part remembered every letter, every threat, every time she'd stood on my driveway acting untouchable. I said yes. Not out of spite, but because boundaries matter. The officer nodded and noted it down. Karen was informed. She would receive a citation, and that further investigation could follow depending on HOA, records, and neighbor statements. She started crying, claiming she was only trying to do her job. The officer responded gently but firmly that jobs don't come with immunity. That line stuck with me. As paperwork was completed, the crowd slowly dispersed. Neighbors exchanged looks of disbelief and relief. A few even thanked me quietly for standing my ground. One told me she'd been afraid to challenge Karen for years. Hearing that confirmed what I'd suspected all along. This wasn't about my truck. It was about control. Before leaving, the officers advised me to install clearer signage, and keep copies of all HOA correspondence. They also suggested attending the next board meeting. Because leadership changes often follow incidents like this, Karen was escorted to her car, no longer speaking, her clipboard left behind on the curb. When the cruisers drove away and the tow truck pulled off, the street returned to normal, but something fundamental had changed. The invisible line she'd crossed was now visible to everyone. Power, once exposed, doesn't easily recover. I closed my garage, stood there for a moment, and realized that peace sometimes comes from confrontation, not avoidance. And this story still wasn't over yet. The days after the incident were quieter, but the silence felt different. Like the neighborhood was finally breathing again. Word spread quickly about what happened, and for once, the story didn't come from Karen's version of events. Neighbors shared security footage, police report numbers, and first-hand accounts. Facts replaced rumors, and that shift mattered more than anything. Within a week, an official notice from the HOA board appeared in everyone's mailbox. It stated that enforcement actions were under review and that a special meeting would be held to address recent overreach. Karen's name wasn't mentioned, but everyone knew. When I attended that meeting, the room was packed in a way I'd never seen before. People who had stayed silent for years finally showed up. The board president opened with a carefully worded apology on behalf of the association. Then Karen stood up. She looked smaller somehow, stripped of her usual confidence. She tried to explain her intentions, saying she only wanted to protect property values. But when homeowners asked direct questions about trespassing, unauthorized inspections, and false tows, she had no real answers. The board voted that night to remove her from any enforcement role pending further review. The motion passed unanimously. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me, thanking me for standing firm. One said she'd almost sold her house because of the constant harassment. Another admitted he'd paid fines he never actually owed, just to avoid confrontation. Hearing that was sobering. What happened in my garage wasn't a one-time mistake. It was part of a pattern enabled by silence. A few days later, I received confirmation that the trespassing citation had been finalized. Karen also received a formal notice barring her from entering any homeowner's property without explicit permission. The tow company sent me an apology letter and assured me they'd change their verification policies because of this incident. Real consequences, real change. Standing in my garage, looking at my truck exactly where it belonged, I felt a sense of closure. Not because someone lost, but because lines were finally drawn where they should have been all along. HOAs exist to manage communities, not to bully individuals. Authority without accountability always collapses eventually. This experience taught me something important. Standing up calmly, documenting everything, and letting the law speak is far more powerful than shouting ever could be. Karen didn't get exposed because I yelled. She got exposed because she overstepped, and the truth was undeniable. If there's one takeaway from all of this, it's simple. Know your rights. Protect your boundaries. And never assume someone with a clipboard has more power than the law itself.